Never thought I'd be the kind of man who drives 4 hours in the dark with zip ties and a burner phone in his jacket pocket. But when you pull up to your ex-wife's house and the only sound coming from the backyard is your 11-year-old son crying behind a locked door, something shifts inside you that doesn't shift back. My name is Paul Tremblay. I'm a long-haul trucker out of Moncton, New Brunswick. I run the corridor between Halifax and Montreal, sometimes dipping into Ontario when the contract calls for it. It's not glamorous work. 3 weeks on the road, 1 week home. The money covers the mortgage, the child support, and not much else. But that 1 week home, that week was everything. My son Theo is 11. He's got his mother's brown eyes and my stubborn streak, which is a combination that gets him into trouble at school, but would serve him well later in life. I always figured. He loves hockey, hates math, and had this old tabby cat named Biscuit that he'd had since he was 4. Biscuit slept on his pillow every night. That cat meant the world to him. My ex-wife Renee and I split up 3 years ago. Not dramatically. Not with screaming or lawyers or accusations, just quietly the way marriages sometimes die, slowly, and then all at once. We had a mediator, worked out a schedule, stayed civil for Theo's sake. I thought we'd done things right. She met Gilles about 14 months ago. He ran a landscaping company out of Dieppe. Good-looking guy, the kind who wears cologne to a Saturday barbecue and always seems to be flexing without actually flexing. She seemed happier. Theo said he was okay. I took that at face value. First mistake. I was supposed to be on the road until the Thursday, running a flatbed load of construction materials up to Rivière-du-Loup, then deadheading back. But the shipper in Rivière-du-Loup pushed the receiving window to the following Monday, and my dispatcher told me to take the unplanned days. I was already past Fredericton when the call came in. I turned around. It was a Sunday afternoon in late July, hot the way New Brunswick gets when nobody's ready for it, that sticky, airless heat that makes everything feel slightly wrong. I figured I'd surprise Theo, maybe take him to the rink in Moncton for stick time, maybe just sit on the back step with him and eat chips and watch Biscuit patrol the yard. Normal stuff, the kind of normal stuff you miss when you're gone 3 weeks out of 4. I parked on the street outside Renee's house just after 2 in the afternoon. Her car was in the driveway. So was Gilles' truck, one of those big Ram 1500s with the company logo on the door. I knocked. Nothing. Knocked again. The TV was on inside. I could hear it through the front window. I went around to the side of the house and pushed through the gate to the backyard. That's when I heard it. It was faint. So faint, I almost convinced myself it was the neighbor's kid, or the wind, or something my tired brain was manufacturing after 6 hours behind the wheel. A small, rhythmic sound, like someone trying not to cry and losing the fight. It was coming from the garden shed at the back of the property. One of those prefab metal units, maybe 8 by 10 feet, the kind you buy at Canadian Tire and spend a weekend assembling. Renee used it for the lawnmower and gardening tools. In July, in direct sun, that thing would be an oven. There was a padlock on the door. I don't fully remember crossing the yard. I remember my hand on the hot metal of the door, pressing my ear against it, the smell of cut grass and something else underneath. "Theo," I said, "Buddy, is that you?" The crying stopped. There was a pause so long my chest caved in. "Dad?" His voice was wrecked, cracked and dry, like he'd been screaming and then given up on screaming. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here. Stand back from the door." I found a hatchet hanging on the fence, Gilles's probably, and I went at the padlock until the hasp pulled free of the wood. The door swung open and the heat rolled out like opening an oven mid-bake, thick and suffocating, and Theo was in the far corner on the bare plywood floor, knees pulled to his chest, wearing the same clothes he'd had on in a photo he'd sent me Friday evening, 2 days ago. He squinted against the light. His lips were pale and cracked. There was a plastic ice cream pail in the corner that he'd been using as a toilet. No water, no food that I could see. Just my son, folded into himself like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. I got him up and carried him. He's almost as tall as me, but it didn't matter. I carried him across the yard and into the house through the back door. Renee was at the kitchen table with a glass of white wine, scrolling her phone. She looked up and the color went out of her face in one clean drop, the way it does when someone is guilty and knows exactly what they're guilty of. Gilles came down the hallway from the back bedroom, adjusting his belt. He saw me, saw Theo in my arms, and his jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" he said. Not a question, a statement, like I was the one out of place. I set Theo down in a kitchen chair and filled a glass of water at the sink and put it in his hands. He drank it so fast some of it ran down his chin. I filled it again. "Call 911, I said to Renee. She didn't move. "Paul, call 911 or I will." Gilles stepped into the kitchen. "He's being disciplined. This is between me and Renee and how she parents her son." "He's my son too." He was disrespectful. He lied to Renee about where he'd been after school on Friday. There have to be consequences. Theo tugged at my sleeve. His voice was barely there. "Dad, Biscuit's in the shed too. He put Biscuit in there on Friday and I don't think she's okay. She wasn't moving this morning." I looked at Gilles. He looked back at me. No guilt, just irritation, the way someone looks when a meeting is running over and they have somewhere else to be. I called 911. The RCMP arrived in 11 minutes. Paramedics came in right behind them. They took Theo to the Moncton hospital for assessment. Moderate dehydration, mild heat exhaustion, a bruised shoulder from where he'd thrown himself against the door Friday night trying to get out. He was there for 2 days. I sat next to his bed and held his hand and pretended to sleep in the chair beside him when the nurses came around. I went back to the shed before they took him. Biscuit was in the back corner in her carrier. She'd been in that heat since Friday. She was dead. I took photos. I'm not sure why. Maybe something in the back of my mind already knew that the story wouldn't end with the paramedics. The RCMP arrested Gilles that afternoon. Renee wasn't charged initially, which felt like a second punch after the first. The investigator explained it to me with the patience of someone who has delivered this particular speech many times, knowing about the abuse and failing to stop it was not, by the letter of the law in New Brunswick, the same as committing it. There would be an investigation. CPS would be involved. The process would take time. Time. My son had spent 46 hours in a metal box in 30-degree heat, and the system needed time. The bail hearing was 4 days later. I sat 3 rows back in the provincial court in Moncton in a shirt I'd ironed that morning because I thought it might make me feel like I had some control over something. Gilles' lawyer, a man with a very expensive watch and a very calm voice, argued that the incident was a disciplinary measure that had escalated beyond what his client intended. No prior criminal record. Established business. Deep community ties. The judge set bail at $40,000. Gilles' brother posted it the same afternoon. I watched him walk out through the glass doors of the courthouse in a jacket that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment, talking on his phone like he was already scheduling his week. He'd been in custody for 96 hours. Theo had been in that shed for 46. The protective order kept him away from Theo's school and from my apartment. That was it. The rest of the city was open to him. I drove back to my apartment in Moncton and sat in the parking lot for a long time without going inside. I was supposed to be on the road again in 3 days. I had a run to Quebec City and then a pickup in Drummondville. My dispatcher was already sending messages. I didn't answer any of them. I want to be honest about what happened next because I've thought about it a lot and I still don't know how to feel. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it. I did it anyway. Gilles kept a schedule the way men like him keep everything, rigidly, as though discipline is something you perform for other people to observe. He was back at his company yard in Dieppe by the following Monday morning, running his crew like nothing had happened. His truck was in the lot by 6:30 a.m. and gone by 4. He trained at a gym in Moncton 3 evenings a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and left around 9. I know this because I watched him. For 2 weeks I watched him. I borrowed a work van from my buddy Luke, who runs a small electrical contracting outfit in Riverview. I told him I needed it for some freelance moving work. He didn't ask questions. He never has. On a Thursday evening, I parked in the lot adjacent to the gym, down the row from his truck, and I waited. He came out at 8:55 with his gym bag and the particular walk of a man who has never once doubted that the world has arranged itself for his convenience. He was alone. I got out of the van. He stopped when he saw me. "You're not supposed to be near me," he said. "That order covers Theo, not you." His eyes did a quick calculation. "Call yourself a lawyer," he said. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. You're in a parking lot in Dieppe at 9 o'clock with your victim's father. Let's see how that unfolds." He didn't call anyone. He crossed his arms and did the thing men like him always do when they feel cornered. He got louder. "Your kid is soft," he said. "I was trying to do René a favor. He needed to learn that lying has real consequences. My father used to." He stalked himself. But I'd already heard enough. Something in the way he almost said it, the ease, the reflex, told me this wasn't a man who had made one terrible decision in a bad moment. This was a man who believed in what he'd done, who would do it again. I had a taser and a roll of duct tape in the inside pocket of my jacket. I know how that sounds. When it was done, I drove east on the Trans-Canada and turned off onto a logging road I knew from a contract I'd run 2 winters ago, delivering equipment to a forestry operation outside Shediac. There was a steel storage container at the back of a staging area, the kind they use for equipment and fuel. I'd passed it 100 times. I knew the road, I knew the gate code, I knew the cameras were on the front of the main building and not the back lot. The container was unlocked. I threw a bucket inside, a 1.5 liters of water, and a granola bar. More than Theo had gotten. I thought about that. Theo had gotten nothing. Shields was awake when I got him out of the van. His eyes were doing the thing. Eyes do when the body understands what the brain is refusing to process. He tried to scream through the tape. I cut the zip ties on his ankles so he could stand, and walked him to the container door. 46 hours, I said. That's how long Theo was in that shed. Starting now. I pushed him inside and closed the door and put a padlock through the handle. The sound the metal door made when it shut, that hollow, final clang, hit me somewhere I didn't expect. I stood there for a moment in the dark of the staging area with the night bugs going and the distant sound of highway traffic, and I thought about Theo hearing that same sound on a Friday evening in July, when he was 11 years old and had done nothing worse than lie about where he'd been after school. I drove back to Moncton. I went to my apartment. I ate half a sandwich and didn't taste any of it. I went back every 6 hours. I'd crack the ventilation slot at the top of the container and speak through it. I told him where Theo was at that same point in the timeline. Hour 6, still thinking someone's coming. Knocking on the door every few minutes, calling for his mother. Hour 12, the knocking had slowed. He was rationing the water without enough water to ration. Hour 18, he'd tried digging at the door seam with his fingernails and given up. He was sitting in the corner the same way I'd found Theo. Hour 24, Gilles was not pounding on the walls anymore. His voice through the vent was a different register entirely. "Please, I hear you. I understand. Just let me out." "You're at the halfway point," I said. Theo had 22 more hours. I closed the vent. Around the 30-hour mark, he started bargaining. He'd plead guilty. He'd waive the trial. He'd surrender his passport, leave the province, never contact René or Theo again. He said he was sorry, and I believed him, and I also knew that sorry from inside a locked box is not the same thing as sorry in the free world, and I kept that distinction in mind. I had left my old work phone in the container with the voice memo app running. I never told him it was there. At hour 38, Gilles talked for a long time. He talked about what he'd done, in specific detail, without prompting. He talked about how Theo wasn't the first child in his life he'd done this to. He'd had a son from a previous relationship in Moncton, a boy named, he said, Olivier, who he'd corrected the same way more than once before. That relationship ended. He talked about how Renee had known on Saturday morning and had said nothing because she was afraid of him. He said this plainly, the way people say things when they've stopped performing. At hour 46, I opened the container door. The man inside was not the same man I'd locked in there. He was in the corner with his knees pulled up and his eyes somewhere distant, and he'd stopped caring about the water hours ago. I'd seen animals in traps with more presence in their faces. I called the RCMP non-emergency line from the burner phone and told them there was a man in medical distress at the forestry staging area off Route 134 near Shediac and gave them the gate code. Then I drove Gilles' truck back to the gym parking lot, wiped it down with a rag, and left it where he'd parked it Thursday night. The recording was complicated legally. Gilles' lawyer argued that a confession made under duress and without a caution was inadmissible under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and he was not entirely wrong. The Crown prosecutor argued that no one had compelled Gilles to speak. He'd been alone, or believed he was alone, and the statements were voluntary in the technical sense. There were months of legal arguments I don't fully understand and couldn't afford a lawyer to explain properly. What I do know is this. The recording contained Gilles describing, in his own voice and in significant detail, what he had done to Theo and what he had previously done to Olivier. Olivier's mother was contacted. She had tried to file a report 4 years earlier and had been told there was insufficient evidence. She had the records of that attempt. With the recording, there was suddenly sufficient evidence. Gilles pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forcible confinement, 1 count of child endangerment, 1 count of animal cruelty, and 1 count of uttering threats. He received 6 years in a federal institution. No house arrest. No conditional sentence. The Crown pushed hard on the prior conduct involving Olivier, and the judge listened. Renee cooperated fully with CPS. She entered a residential treatment program for trauma and alcohol dependency. She testified against Gilles at the sentencing hearing. I sat in the back of that courtroom and watched her do it, and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something in that direction. CPS granted me primary custody of Theo with Renee having supervised visits as she progressed through treatment. She's been sober for 5 months. She shows up. She brought Theo a new hockey stick for his birthday and sat with me in the lobby of the arena for his game without either of us saying anything particularly difficult. We're learning what co-parenting looks like when there's no map. Theo has been seeing a psychologist in Moncton, a man named Dr. Arsenault who works mainly with kids who've experienced trauma. He's been going for 7 months. At first, he didn't want to talk about the shed at all. Now he talks about it in past tense, which Dr. Arsenault says is significant. He's started sleeping without the hall light on, most nights. He went back to his hockey league in September and scored 2 goals in his first game back. We got a new cat in October, a young orange Tom from the shelter in Riverview. Theo named him Toast. The RCMP did investigate the circumstances of how Gilles ended up in that container. An investigator came to my apartment in November, a woman in plain clothes with a notepad and the particular calm of someone who has put most things together and wants to see if you'll confirm them. She asked me a number of questions. I answered the ones I could answer without lying, which wasn't all of them. She looked at me for a long moment at the end and said that it was unusual how these things sometimes found their own resolution, and she left, and nobody came back. I think about that a lot. I'm not telling this story because I think I was right. I know I wasn't right, not in any way that holds up in daylight. I crossed lines that mattered. I became something I would have been afraid of if you described it to me 2 years ago. My therapist, yes, I see one now, a man in Riverview who works with shift workers and people in high-stress occupations, calls it moral residue. The thing that sticks to you after you've done something you can't take back. even for reasons you still believe in. What I'm saying is this: if you are in a blended family and something feels wrong, a name you're not allowed to mention, a tone in your child's voice you don't recognize, a pattern of excuses that don't quite line up, don't wait for it to make more sense. It won't make more sense. Document things. Write down dates and times, screenshot texts. If your child says something that concerns you, take it seriously in writing immediately so there's a record that exists before you need it. Talk to a family lawyer. In New Brunswick, legal aid can be reached at 1-833-867-FREE9, and there are duty counsel at most provincial courthouses. You have more options before the worst happens than you will after it. I'm writing this now because 2 months ago, Theo came home from school with an assignment. His teacher had asked the class to write about someone they admired. He showed it to me before he handed it in. It was about me. Not about what I'd done to Gilles. He didn't know the details, and I intended to keep it that way for a long time yet. It was about the moment I'd opened the shed door, about hearing my voice through the metal, about the glass of water. He wrote, "I knew my dad would come. I just didn't know if I would still be okay when he got there. When he picked me up, I knew I was going to be okay. That is why I admire him." 9 sentences, the most important thing anyone has ever written about me. I've been doing this job for 16 years. I've driven through whiteouts on the TCH in January, jackknifed in a ditch outside Amherst, had my load shift in the mountains east of Quebec City at 2 in the morning with no cell signal. I've handled bad situations. I've kept my head, but the closest I've come to losing everything I thought I was, the closest I've come to finding out what I actually am, was a Sunday afternoon in July in a backyard in Moncton, kneeling on the grass with my arms around my son while the paramedics came through the side gate and the light went gold over the fence. And Theo said, "You came back early." And I said, "Yeah, buddy, I came back early." And I said, "Yeah, buddy, I came back early," and I held on. I still think about the hatchet in my hand, the way it felt when the hasp finally pulled free of the wood. It wasn't a heroic moment. It was desperate and loud, and my hands were shaking the whole time. But that's the thing about the worst moments of your life. They don't feel the way you imagined they would. They just feel like the only thing left to do. What happened to Theo didn't come from nowhere. Gilles wasn't a man who woke up one morning and decided to become who he was. The patterns were there before Renee met him, before Theo ever walked into that house. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it over these past months, is that people who hurt children almost always have a story they've told themselves that makes it reasonable, a logic, a framework that sounds from the inside, like discipline or strength or doing what's necessary. Gilles had been doing this his whole adult life. The consequences had never caught up to him, so he kept going. That's how it works. Not evil in some dramatic sense, just a pattern that was never interrupted. I interrupted it. The way I did it is something I'll carry for the rest of my life, and I'm not asking anyone to sign off on it. But I think about what would have happened if I hadn't come home early, if the dispatcher hadn't called, if I'd stayed on the road until Thursday like I was supposed to. Theo was already at 46 hours when I found him. I don't let myself finish that thought. What I keep coming back to is this: the choices that matter most are usually the ones nobody prepares you for. Renee made a choice to stay quiet on Saturday morning. Gilles made a choice every single time, going back years. I made choices I can't walk back. Theo made a choice too, to keep knocking on that door, to keep calling out, to not give up on the idea that someone was coming. That last one is the one that gets me. 11 years old, 46 hours in the heat, and he hadn't stopped believing someone would come. That kind of stubbornness, the refusal to quit on yourself even when every reasonable signal says to, that's not something you can teach in a classroom. It lives in a kid, or it doesn't. I don't know where Theo got it. I'd like to think some of it came from me, but I'm honest enough to know he grew most of it himself. I've been thinking a lot about what I want him to understand as he gets older. Not about what I did, not yet, but about how to move through a world that is not always going to be fair or safe or arranged in his favor. I want him to know that being a decent person is not a passive thing. It takes work and attention. It means noticing when something feels wrong and saying so, even when staying quiet would be easier. It means thinking carefully before you act, not because thinking will always lead you to the right answer, but because the alternative is acting on impulse and living with whatever that costs, and it means getting back up. Theo knows that last part already, maybe better than I do. I look at him now, skating hard in his league games, laughing at something dumb on TV with toast curled on his lap, writing 9 sentences about his dad for a school assignment, and I think about how close it came to being different. That thought never fully leaves. But neither does the other one, that he's here and he's okay, and we're both still standing. Some things you can only understand from the other side of them. I'm on the other side now. I'm not sure I'd want to go back, even to undo my own worst decisions, because those decisions are part of how we got here. That feels like the most honest thing I can say about it.